Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel, Nemo Propaganda, bringing you guys the Buchardt S400 Mark II. I'm super excited to have my hands on these ahead of launch. Super cool. All right, I'm gonna tell you about some specs and standout features like I usually do. I'll throw the main ones on screen. I'll tell you what it sounds like. We'll do some comparisons and we'll wrap it up. I will, of course, throughout this video, compare this to the outgoing model, so stay with me. Now, I'm not even gonna lie, guys. I am super hyped to have these here. The original S400s were one of my favorite speakers. I've owned them ever since they first came out. They're one of my daily drivers. I listen to them all the time. And when I found out Buchardt Audio was gonna have a new model, the excitement was real, guys. It was super real. So let's get into it. So first, I will tell you about some standout features. So the symmetry, the visual look, love it. You know, usually the tweeter looks a lot smaller, but here we've got this big waveguide. That's the same 6.5 inches as the 6.5 inch midwoofer. I think that's super cool. Out back, we've got this huge passive radiator. If you don't know what a passive radiator is or what it does, essentially it's like a port. And if you don't know what a port does, well, a port increases bass quantity at a certain frequency. It's called the port tuning frequency. The passive radiator accomplishes the same goal. It increases the bass quantity at a certain tuning frequency, except it allows you to have a smaller cabinet. Now, you might be wondering, you know, if it's the same as a port, but lets you have a smaller cabinet, why doesn't everyone do it? Well, it's more expensive to do, and it's a lot more complicated to get it done right. Because if you get it wrong, you'll have more bass, but it won't really sound too good. So proper execution of a passive radiator can be challenging. Anyhow, some other standout features. The front of the cabinet is on a little bit of a rake. I think it gives it a cool look. I like the binding posts out back as well, and the fact that they're on a nice metal terminal plate. Usually we see plastic around this price, which really bothers me. I don't really complain about it too often because it's so common, but I think if you're spending more than $1,000 on speakers, the terminal plate should be metal. Like, why does it have to be plastic? It's so cheap. Anyway, so some differences. I'll tell you, there are some parts that carry over and some parts that are entirely new to this model. The parts that carry over are going to be those binding posts, that passive radiator, the deep waveguide, and the tweeter that sits inside of it. Those carry over from the outgoing model. Parts that are new to this model are going to be the cabinet. It's larger, it's heavily braced now. The mid-bass driver is going to be an entirely new unit, being a paper cone instead of the previous model's metal cone. And the crossover, very overbuilt crossover, is entirely new for this model as well. Those of you guys that know a little bit more about electronics were probably very impressed by that picture. I know it uses some very high quality parts, and you know, as far as crossovers go at this price range, I haven't seen anything like that at this price range. Anyhow, I digress. So what does it sound like? So the top end presentation, compared to the old or outgoing S400, it's going to have a little bit more treble energy. It's not bright. The old S400 wasn't bright. This isn't bright, but it does have more treble energy, much better detail retrieval, better and more precise imaging, and a sound that is never hard on the ears. It is still easygoing and easy to listen to, but rewards you with more detail than the outgoing model. The presentation is going to project off the front baffles and into the room a little bit, improving soundstage depth by quite a bit. The previous model S400 had a presentation that was more this big wall of sound that just like wrapped around you, and it was super cool. And this new model still accomplishes that, but with now more depth, more precise imaging, and things of that nature. And speaking of depth, let's move down to the mid-range where you really see that depth in the presentation. Vocal performance. One thing I like about speakers presentation is, and a lot of speakers can't do this, these can, it's when the vocalist's presentation is pushed in front of the music just a little bit and has space and air around it. It gives the sense of realism that is absolutely awesome, and the S400 Mark II accomplish it in a very good way. If you're a fan of vocal presentation and you like that air and space and projection to be there, this does it really well. There's also more texture in the mid-range as well that I did like. Moving down to the bass. So You guys know Nemo Propaganda likes to talk about bass, so let's get it. There's no mid-bass bump. Very happy for that. I don't like a mid-bass bump or hump. The mid-bass is going to be a little bit more articulate than the outgoing model and have better note-to-note distinction. The bass overall is more articulate and has better note-to-note distinction. The bass on this speaker is going to have faster transients, stronger attack. It's going to extend lower, if you could believe that. However, it's not going to draw attention to itself like the outgoing model did. This is interesting because I think some reviewers might think the new S400 Mark II has less bass. Then I think some people will think the S400 Mark II has more bass, like me. Who's right? Well, I am. And sorry if that sounds arrogant, but your boy Nemo Propaganda knows bass. I review mostly subwoofers, guys. So when it comes to the bass portion of a speaker, you best believe I'm going to get it right. Let me explain. So the outgoing model's bass presentation was very SPL style bass, meaning it was strong, it was powerful, it pressurized the room, and it did draw attention to itself, even sometimes becoming the focal point of the presentation. That was the previous model. This new model, while it has more bass and more extension, better transient speed, better note-to-note distinction, and the quantity is slightly increased as well, there's more refinement. The bass is more resolving, and now it's coming from an ink back background and projecting forward into the room. It's still strong. It still pressurizes your room. In fact, it's stronger. It extends lower, but it doesn't draw attention to itself. And because of that, some reviewers, perhaps who don't, let's just say maybe they're not as intimately familiar with bass as Nemo Propaganda is, some people, I think, the way they interpret bass is how much of your attention it draws or pulls. If that's the way you interpret bass, you might think the outgoing model has more bass because it draws more of your attention. But it's not true. If you listen for the actual bass and the extension of it, and you're actually focusing, critically listening to the quantity of it, it's the way it pressurizes the room, its attack, how deep it is, you will find that my assessment here is correct in saying that the new S400 does actually have more bass in quantity, in extension, and most importantly, refinement. This is a very challenging combination of attributes to have all together in one speaker, and my hat is off to Buchardt for pulling it off on this speaker. It's easy for a speaker to have SQ style bass, SQ meaning sound quality, and that's what this has. This is SQ style bass now. The outgoing model is what I would call SPL style bass. It's easy for a speaker to have SQ style bass where its transient response is quick, its note-to-note distinction, it's good, its articulation is good, it comes from an ink back background, but there's not a lot of it. The quantity is super low, like the Focal Aria 906. It's very common, actually, for good speakers that have good bass to not have a lot of it. The challenge is having all those good SQ characteristics and still having high bass quantity. That's the challenge, and Buchardt was able to pull that off in a very good way. So, sorry if I got hung up on bass a little bit here, guys. Nemo Propaganda, I love bass. You know what I mean? It's kind of my thing now. So, is it time for comparisons? Let me think here. I think it's time for comparisons. Okay, so let's first compare it to, we already did compare it to the original S400, but I'll do it real quick in a succinct way here. So the S400 Mark II versus the original S400. And by the way, the original S400 is still a phenomenal speaker. The original S400 by direct comparison is more laid back, has less detail, and the new S400 is more detail. It's still easy on the ears, however. It's still a very smooth and more refined presentation, in fact, up top. Moving down to the mid-range, the new S400 has a better mid-range. The old S400 mid-range was good, but it didn't have any like woo to it, if that makes sense. It wasn't like super rich or didn't have that vocal presentation that popped out with its space and air around it. The new one has that. So the new one takes the edge in the mid-range also. The bass performance, big difference between the two. Essentially, and I'll just say it in a nutshell, the old S400 had SPL style bass, where the bass was strong, powerful, pressurized the room very well, but did draw attention to itself and sometimes become the focal point of the presentation, whereas the new S400 Mark II has actually better extension, more bass quantity, but is so much more refined that it comes from an ink black background instead and never dominates the music or becomes a focal point of the presentation unless you critically listen to the bass only. Overall, from top to bottom, the new S400 Mark II is a huge upgrade from the outgoing model in every area with no compromise or downsides. A lot of times when there's an improvement in one area, there's usually, you know, a sacrifice somewhere else, right? Like, oh, the speaker's like, got better detail, but it's a little brighter now, so a little bit of fatigue can happen. No, none of that. None of that, guys. With the new S400 Mark II, there are only improvements. No downsides, no compromises to speak of, only improvements. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of Porsche when they released a new 911. The Porsche 911 is a phenomenal car. Those of you that have been lucky enough to drive will know what I'm talking about. It has this awesome combination of refinement, luxury, and then performance that is like, wow, so amazing, this combination. And when they release a new one, it's a little bit better at everything, but it's still undeniably a Porsche 911. And that's one of the things that makes the 911 so awesome, and that's why so many people around the world love the Porsche 911. And I can say the same thing here. The new S400 Mark II is still undeniably a Buchardt S400 product. It still has all those awesome things we loved about the original S400. The huge expansive soundstage, the strong and powerful bass, a presentation that's never hard on the ears. But it has all these improvements now on top of that. Detail retrieval is better. Mid-range is better. Bass is buttoned up, tighter and cleaner. It's awesome. It's really awesome. Okay, I'm getting a little too hyped up here, guys. Let's answer one question now, and then we'll move on to another comparison. Existing S400 owners, should you upgrade? Okay, this is a tough question to answer because I am an original S400 owner and I am going to upgrade, and I'll explain why. So, right now, there's two speakers I listen to nonstop. These two speakers are my daily drivers, the original Buchardt S400 and the Focal Aria 906. I go back and forth because the Focal Aria 906 has a few things that I love, and the S400 original has a few things that I love. The few things that I love for the S400 original is that huge sound stage, that strong bass, that's easy on the ears, and this has all of that. And what I love about the Focal Aria 906 is that detail retrieval that the new S400 has now. The low volume performance of the Focal Aria 906, that thing is a huge low volume champion. The new S400 Mark II now, very good at low volumes, and I am a low volume listener. That's huge for me. So with the new S400 Mark II, I don't need to go back and forth between the Focal Aria 906 and the original S400 anymore, based on my mood. Because what would happen is I'd listen to the original S400 for a couple weeks generally and be like, oh, I love this, this is great. But then I'll start to miss some detail, some sparkle, some air. And I'll take them off the stands and I would put the Focal Aria 906 up and I'm like, oh, there's that detail, that air, that separation, because the Focal Aria 906 is really good with that. But the new S400 Mark II, it bridges the gap between the things that I love about each speaker and gives me this like, okay, that's me, that's me. So yeah, look, I'm upgrading. Should you? I'll leave you with this. The original S400 is still a fantastic speaker and worth its price. The new one is better, yes. But if you already own the original S400, you own a fantastic speaker, without a doubt. It's just like if you own a Porsche 911 and they come out with a new one, you still have an amazing car. There's no question there. Should you upgrade? Well, let's go back to the Porsche 911. So if you've got a Porsche 911 and they release a new one, your car's about 5-6 years old now. If you've got an extra 150K laying around, you'll probably just upgrade, right? If money ain't a thing, you'll just upgrade. But if buying that 911 was a struggle for you initially, you had to maybe, save up for maybe 6 months to get that down payment together. Making that monthly payment was a little bit of a challenge, and you're happy that thing's finally paid off, man, and you could just barely afford the maintenance. You probably won't upgrade to the brand new one right away. Essentially, what I'm saying is this. If money ain't a thing for you, by all means, upgrade. The new model is fantastic and to me, worth it. But if, you know, it's going to cause a fight with the wife, or it's going to take you a couple of months to save the money, or it's going to make you have to live a little tighter for a while, the S400 original is a fantastic speaker. So don't get too much like FOMO, you know what I'm saying? Anyhow, let's move on and talk about some other comparisons. I've been reviewing mostly subwoofers for the past year and a half, but I have reviewed some speakers around this price range. Let's talk about the KEF LS50 Meta. That thing's $1,500. So the KEF LS50 Meta is a much smaller speaker, and I do think it's important to point that out. It's quite a bit short. It's probably comes up to about here on the S400 Mark II. Let's start at the top. The top-end presentation of each speaker is a little bit different. The S400 Mark II is going to give you a little bit more of a refined, smoother sound up top. The LS50 Meta is going to be a little bit sharper by direct comparison. It's not a sharp-sounding speaker. It's just by direct comparison. The the KEF LS50 Meta, its note-to-note distinction in the higher frequencies are extremely good. I've not heard a speaker better at that price. The S400 Mark II note-to-note distinction in the higher frequencies is still very, very good. The LS50 Meta, that's just one of its strong suits. Both have a presentation that is pretty good. I will say the LS50 is just going to be a little bit more on the forward side. You'll call it brighter by direct comparison. Moving down to the mid-range, both have a really good mid-range. The KEF LS50 Meta is able to give you that vocalist projecting into the room with its separate air and space, but the S400 Mark II does it better. It does it with a bigger sense of scale. It does it with more realism. It's fuller sounding. It is just better at doing that. Moving down to the bass overall, this is no contest here, guys. The KEF LS50 Meta is a 5¼ inch driver, and the speaker is smaller. The bass frequencies that it can produce, it does well and with authority. However, a lot of people say it falls off a cliff right after about 70 hertz. That's most people's in-room experience. That's not a whole lot of extension. The S400 Mark II by direct comparison, these bad boys are extending down to a strong 30 hertz. You can't compare, you know what I mean? You just can't. The S400 Mark II, they walk all over the LS50 with respect to bass and any descriptor you want to use to describe bass. One thing also, another area where the Mark II is better than the LS50 Meta. The LS50 Meta, it's horizontal. I always get them mixed up. Vertical, horizontal. It's horizontal. Soundstage is pretty good. Certain effects can stage really wide on the LS50 Meta, but for the overall soundstage itself or sound field, the Buchardt S400 Mark II is wider. Vertically, the Mark II is superior. The vertical soundstage of the LS50 Meta does not even come close to the Buchardt S400 Mark II. The LS50 Meta is a short speaker, and its soundstage sounds like a short speaker. Also, soundstage depth is much better on the Buchardt S400 Mark II as well. Now, with all that said, the KEF LS50 Meta is a good speaker. It really is. It's like $600-700 cheaper, and I think it's important to remember that. For its price of $1,500, it is fantastic. I will also say it, with its 5¼ inch driver, the LS50 Meta cannot come close to filling a room like the Mark II can, especially if you have a medium or a larger size room. So that's that comparison. Let's talk about the Focal Aria 906 versus the Buchardt S400 Mark II. It's another speaker I love a lot, and I own it. So the Focal Aria 906 is definitely going to be brighter compared to the S400 Mark II. While both speakers have very, very good detail retrieval and detail overall, the S400 with its metal dome tweeter is going to give you a little bit more detail overall. They're both going to image well. However, the S400 Mark II actually images better. It is more precise. With the Aria, it's almost like you're getting so much detail, it's almost difficult for it to image so razor sharp and good. The amount of detail you get from the Aria is like more in line with speakers that are generally quite a bit more expensive, so that might be one of the compromises there. Is it time for soundstage? No, let's stay with the top end. The Aria 906, while it's brighter, is not a harsh sounding speaker. However, and this is important, if your gear is on the brighter side, I can see the Aria becoming sharp or harsh for some people. So that is important to keep in mind. Whereas with the S400, I don't see that happening really. Unless your room is really odd, I don't see anyone describing the S400 presentation as being sharp at all. Its top end is more smooth, refined, and resolving. I would say it's a little bit more refined than the Focal Aria 906. Again, though the 906 does give you a little bit more detail and a little bit of a sharper sound. Moving down to the mid-range, the S400 has the better mid-range by quite a bit. The Focal Aria 906's mid-range is cool. It is clean, but is a little bit reserved, you know, and a little bit perhaps dry by direct comparison. The S400's mid-range is going to be a little bit thicker. It's going to have that experience with the vocalist projecting into the room with a sense of air, space, and depth that the Focal Aria 906 simply cannot stack up to. Moving down to the bass. So both speakers are about equivalent in terms of volumetric size, I believe, and they both use 6.5-inch mid-bass drivers. However, the S400 Mark II, again, this is a situation where there's no contest. The Focal Aria 906 simply cannot compete with respect to bass performance. And the Focal Aria 906, its bass presentation is SQ style bass, like the Mark II also has SQ style bass, but the bass quantity is way lower on the Focal Aria 906. It can't extend as low, the quantity isn't there, the sense of fullness isn't there at all by direct comparison. Now look, the Aria 906 doesn't have bad bass. It has bass that is more common for bookshelf speakers, whereas the S400 Mark II has bass that is almost more common with a floor standing speaker. Now, I'm not saying it has the bass of a double impact, guys. Come on, be reasonable. But the S400 Mark II does have more bass than some floor standing speakers I've heard. I'm not going to name names here. Okay, I almost did it. I almost said it. I almost said who I was thinking of, but I can't remember the name, honestly, guys. I can't remember the name. How convenient, right? Anyhow, that wraps it up for the comparisons. Let me think if there's anything else I want to touch on here. This is a big win in my opinion. This is a big win. The speaker is really good. It's beautiful. It sounds great. And I think it's got a sound a lot of people are going to like. The complaints that people had with the previous S400 have all been addressed. A lot of people wanted better low volume performance. You got it. A lot of people wanted more detail. You've got it. Some people wanted that bass to be cleaned up and tightened up. You got it. It's done. It's, you know what I mean? So essentially what I think is going on here is, you know, the original S400 came out when Buchardt Audio was a small company, you know, and, you know, it was a great speaker. And based on the success of that speaker, the company has grown considerably over these past few years. The company has become more refined, more matured, has more experience now. They've been able to do more R&D. And I'm even willing to bet the owner himself has matured as a person, an audiophile, and a business owner. And they've been able to take all of that maturing and refinement and learning and apply it to this new model, S400 Mark II. Yeah, I dig it, boys. I dig it. I'll leave you with this summary. I'll just leave this on the screen. This is a screenshot of an email that I sent to Mads giving him my sound assessment of the speaker. And I'm leaving this here because this is essentially like a TLDR version of this entire video, I suppose. So if you want to pause the video and just read through that summary, because we've probably covered a lot here, that'll help kind of remind you of the core important attributes of the new S400 Mark II. So I think that about wraps it up, guys. I don't know what else to tell you. These things are freaking fantastic. I'm looking forward to getting a pair myself. I'm a little nervous to publish this video because I feel like the minute I do, Buchardt Audio is going to email me and be like, all right, pack them up, send them back, and they won't be in my care anymore. A lot of you guys might think reviewers get like, you know, special treatment. I'm pretty sure if I want these, it's I might have to wait a while because it's a new product and it's a hot product. It's going to be like the it's probably going to be like that KEF KC62 when that thing came out, it just sold out. You know what I mean? Sold out quick, and then everyone had to wait like a few weeks for KEF to like run a bunch more and make more, and then it sold out again. And that's probably what we're going to see happen here. So I'd say if you're interested, I would definitely order them. You know what I mean? Anyhow. yeah, that wraps it up, guys. Great speaker. I've really enjoyed my time with them, and I am very much looking forward to owning a pair, and I think that's the highest compliment I can give a product I review. If you have any questions, let's talk about them in the comments below. Until next time, later.